Hey guys, I'm Navya and I'm going to be telling you how I got an A star in A-level psychology and hopefully give you some tips to take away to help you get an A star in A-level psychology. So I didn't actually do very well in the beginning of year 12, but my psychology grades increased at the end of year 12 all the way until the A-level exams when I finally got an A star. So if you're struggling with psychology or if you just want to look at how to improve your grades, these tips might help you. First of all, during the exam, you're going to have to write a lot. You're going to have extremely limited time and you're going to have to be writing every second of the whole exam period. If you're finishing in half the time, you've probably not written enough. Most people are going to be writing till the very last minute, so make sure you know how much time you need for every question right before you start the exam. You should be aiming for 20 minutes for a 16 marker, but nothing more than 25 minutes. The first step to doing well in any A-level exam is to understand the content. I was very lucky because I had really good teachers. The best way to understand the content is to use the help of your teachers. Pay attention in classes, and if you don't understand anything, go back and ask them to re-explain it because that's what they're there for. Don't hesitate to go ask them because at the end of the day, you're the one who's going to be benefiting if you do ask them. You literally cannot get an extremely high grade unless you know everything in the specification. So another biggest tip is to always use a specification. When you're learning a new topic, keep the specification right next to you and make sure that you're understanding everything that's going on there. When it comes to essays like 8 markers or 16 markers, it's important that you practice these essays before the exam under timed conditions. It's extremely important to practice under timed conditions because in the real exam, you're going to have to do this in very little time. And practicing these essays beforehand allows you to actually understand them. Don't just memorize them because you're not going to be able to recall everything from memory. For me, I'm not very great at memorizing things, so I always found it easier if I was just able to understand it and then write it in my own words in an essay. When you're understanding the content for an essay, it's a very good idea to have an essay plan where you write down the most important points and make sure that you're including them in your essay. Do it under timed conditions, reflect back if you've included all those points, and then rewrite it again to make sure that you've got all the points in there eventually in your last try. The most important part of an essay is the evaluation, which is the AO3, because they always count for many more marks than the AO1 or AO2. For a 16 marker, AO3 is 10 marks worth of content. And for an 8 marker, it's usually 5 or 4 marks, depending on whether there's AO2 or not. So it's important to understand how to write the evaluation. I'm sure you've heard this a lot, but the best way is to use the PEAL structure, which stands for point, evidence, explanation, and link. State the point that you're trying to make in your first paragraph. Give it some evidence like research statistics or studies. Elaborate and explain what you're trying to talk about, how the evidence supports the point, and then link it back to the question of the essay. This would mean that you understand the point that you're making. Does it support the theory or does it go against the theory? Because it's important to know that when you're trying to link it back to the question. In my sixth form, we had a session where we listed down a bunch of emergency evaluation points. These usually come from the research methods unit. For example, if a study is a lab study, you can always elaborate on the advantages of a lab study and then link it back to the question. Or you can contradict a study or a theory by talking about bias. We have to be more specific in what kind of bias. Gender bias, culture bias. And if you wanted to be even more specific, you could go into the details of alpha bias and beta bias. I do remember that I actually did use a couple of emergency evaluation points in my exams, and if I hadn't, I don't know how many marks I might have lost, but you know, the A star is on the line there. So understanding the theory allows you to use these emergency evaluation points from research methods, because if you haven't understood it, you're going to have to be relying on your memory of every single evaluation point that you've learned about it. And during an exam under stressful timed conditions, you might end up forgetting it, and you can't spend too much time trying to recall something that is taking you too long to remember. One of the most important tips that you might have heard a lot of times is to revise using active recall. This means not just writing notes or reading off a textbook, but actually applying your knowledge so that it sticks with you for longer. When I was practicing essays, what I would do was type out the essay plans instead of write them, because I'm just a faster typer and it was more efficient to save time. But these are when you're trying to remember all the points. You might look at the AO1 and AO3 points that the teachers had given you and then learn them and then try and blurt them out in an essay plan. It's going to be much easier to remember them if you've written them down by yourself instead of just reading it once and expecting to remember all the points. I have heard that flashcards have been helpful for some people. I personally didn't love them just because they were extremely time consuming to make. So obviously if you think flashcards work for you, make sure that you have them ready months before the exams and that you're practicing them all the time. I've never actually looked at Anki, but I do remember that I used Quizlet the first time and then realized you have to pay for it. So I found a free version of Quizlet online called note.io. This video is not sponsored by them, but they were really good. I would use flashcards when I was practicing for a class test because you wouldn't have a whole unit most of the time. It'd be broken down, so I was able to focus on specific topics using flashcards. But my preferred method was to use cheat sheets. On one page, I'd have around 4 topics. I'd stuff them into really small bullet points, and then I'd write down the AO1 and AO3 for every topic and try to go through them and then blurt them into my essay plans type. It's also important to know that when you're writing the AO3, you know how many points you're going to need to get a full 10 marks, so that you're aiming for the maximum marks that you can get. It's not important that you write a lot of points, but more important that you explain each one thoroughly. It's better to write 3 large paragraphs than write 5 small paragraphs, because the examiners are always going to prefer the ones where you've explained it properly. So when I was studying, I'd make sure to remember 3 or 4 points at least, but not any more than that, because I felt like that was too much to be remembering for every single topic. Answer every single question since the new specification. I had answered every single question since the new specification, and this helped me get my A star in A-level psychology. Because sometimes you think you know something, but when you look back at the mark scheme, you realize that you would not have got the marks for what you have written, even though it means the same thing. A-levels are really specific with their keywords, so it's important that you get those keywords from the mark schemes and you're not missing them out when you're writing your answers in the exam. Something that I cannot stress on the most is to plan your timetable strategically. Different methods work for different people, but for me, I found that when I would plan the order of the content that I would study, I found that I would study the content for paper 3 first and then go to paper 2 and then go to paper 1. Because when I started vigorous revision, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't studying everything twice. What I mean is that I'm going to try to explain this, but I don't think it might be very helpful without like images. If that's paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3, I'm going to study paper 3, paper 2 and paper 1 just because paper 1's revision is right before paper 1 exam. So I'm going to smash that exam. Paper 2 revision and paper 2 is also going to have a short amount of time. So right after paper 1 exam, I'm able to record everything properly. And then paper 3, I have to obviously revise again. Instead, if I done paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3, and then paper 1, paper 2 and paper 3, all of them would have had the exact same gap. So my chances of doing well in all of them would be the exact same. But in the other one, my chances of doing well are maximized with paper 1 and paper 2. But also because I had practiced paper 3 first, I obviously had lesser stress because I was the furthest away from my first exam. So I was able to do that in extreme detail, that I was able to remember it before my paper 3 exam. I remember on the last day of school, all my classmates had done paper 1 revision and I was the only one who had done every single paper except paper 1, just because I wanted to make sure that I went into enough detail a couple weeks right before the first paper. Days before the exams, my best revision strategy was to write down cheat sheets. This is because I would be recalling everything from memory and making sure that I had every single topic there. Always refer back to the specification to make sure that I had never missed anything. But one of my biggest ones was using KAHOOTS. In school, we used to do KAHOOTS in class, and they were extremely helpful. But obviously doing KAHOOTS by yourself is not competing with anyone. I found them really helpful because I didn't have to remake anything. I would just find the ones available on Kahoot and do them. Instead of using flashcards for every single topic, I would use KAHOOTS. I'd use them when I was eating, like breakfast, lunch and dinner, just because they were able to help me make sure that I was not wasting any time while also giving me a break from the studying. I'd also do them when I would just get tired of revising, like the real revision method. But these were different because I wouldn't use individual topics, rather I would say paper 1 revision, and I just keep going through them. Kahoot is obviously a very good active recall method, especially with 4 different colours and making sure that the questions are repeated until you get them right. Also, just putting it out there, a free website that I also used during my revision was Tutor2U. These were for evaluation points in case I didn't want to use the ones that were already given to me, or if I felt like I wasn't able to remember one of the ones that were given to me and I wanted to find something easier to remember with lesser numbers, but an evaluation point that I really liked and wanted to use. So if you're studying for A-level psychology, my final message is to make sure that you have a timetable and that you make sure you know what methods work for you best. If you're in year 12, this is your time to experiment, to find out the best method that works for you and your revision. But the most important thing is to understand the content and don't memorize, because when you understand the content, it gives you so much more freedom with not having to force yourself to remember every single thing. So good luck for A-level psychology, and I'll see you in my next video if you stick around.